the writers of Bible books were inspired by God to employ figures of speech, word patterns and recurring motifs to help hearers remember what they'd heard and help them connect it to other parts of the Bible. And as Bible readers, we need to have minds that are attuned to those patterns and techniques. If they are, then we will recognise the motive of the tree of life in the Bible and the principles associated with it that are worked out throughout Scripture, even when the tree of life is not being directly mentioned by name. And that will enhance our appreciation of the gospel and the way of the Lord. And more importantly, perhaps, it will help us focus on the reality and substance of the new creation in Christ, of which the Adamic creation is the shadow. So I'd like you to open your Bible, please, at Genesis 3, where we read of the way of the tree of life. I'm sure you're very familiar with the record in Genesis 2 about the tree of life in the centre of the garden. And that tree of life was there in the centre of the Garden of Eden. And from what we read at the end of chapter 3, it may be presumed that the way of the tree of life held a central place in the religious devotions of Adam and Eve's descendants, at least those in the line of Seth, I think perhaps until the days of Noah. They would have assembled there to worship. So look at what it says in verses 22 to 24 of Genesis 3. And the Lord God said, Behold, the man has become as one of us to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground for which he was taken. So he drove out man and placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubim and a flaming sword which turned every way to keep the way of the tree of life. Cherubim were there to keep the way of the tree of life. That is, they were to prevent unauthorised access to the tree. But over and above being gatekeepers, as it were, they were there to preserve and protect the way of the tree of life, so that they could ensure that those who would be granted the right to eat of it can do so at the appointed time. Reading on then through Genesis, from chapter 4 onwards, it's curious how many special trees are mentioned in the text. I suggest that the prominence of special trees in the text of Genesis reflects the yearning of the patriarchs for the restoration of Eden, for restoration of access to the tree of life. In Genesis 6, we have our first reference to a tree outside the Garden of Eden. Perhaps it was before the cherubim at the east of the garden that Noah learnt that he was to build an ark for the saving of himself and his family. Now, whether that's so or not is beside the point. But I think at that time, Noah would have been conscious of the tree of life and the way of the tree of life when God commanded him to construct an ark, because the objective of that exercise was defined in Hebrews as being for the saving of his house. So Genesis 6, verse 13 and 14. And God said unto Noah, The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make the ark of gopher wood. Room shalt thou make in the ark, and pitch it within and without with pitch. Why does the text specify the species, rather than just prescribing that the ark be made from wood? I mean, what else would you make it from? So purely, the type of tree is significant. It's the gopher wood. This is the only reference in Scripture to gopher wood, which is transliterated from the Hebrew gopher, because we don't really know what it was for certain. It's impossible to be dogmatic about the identity of this species, although most scholars think it likely that the word refers to a resinous timber such as cypress or cedar. Genesis 6 is the only reference in Scripture to gopher wood, which is just translated Hebrew gopher, and it's impossible to be dogmatic about the species, but most scholars think it likely the wood refers to a resinous timber like cypress or cedar. And we certainly know that cypress is widely used in shipbuilding in the ancient Middle East because it's a very tough timber and close-grained and therefore very resistant to water. If the consensus view about the identity of gopherwood is correct, Noah may have seen the command to use this evergreen tree for the construction of an ark as appropriate. Think of these comments made by Peter, which give us an insight as to how Noah might have responded to this revelation from God. Peter tells us that Noah was a preacher of righteousness, who was witnessing to a society in which the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So, conscious that the spirit of rebellion introduced by Adam and Eve in Eden was rampant, Noah may have yearned for the day when the seed of the woman would overcome the seed of the serpent, that day when access to the tree of life would be restored. The ark that Noah was to build prefigured the deliverance from the law of sin and death available through baptism into Christ. And the flood that God told Noah he would send is a type of the judgment that God will pour out upon the nations when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth. So it may be that Noah, on reflection, may have seen in the specification of timber from a specific evergreen tree for construction of the ark a reference to the salvation that the vessel would offer to its occupants. More importantly, he also may have thought about the ultimate deliverance available through access to the tree of life when it's restored. You'll recall that the first evidence that Noah received that the judgment of the flood had passed was also from another evergreen tree, an olive leaf plucked by the dove he sent out from the ark. In Genesis 8 and verse 11, we read, "The dove came into him in the evening tide, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth." This is the first reference in the Bible to the olive tree, which of course is a frequently mentioned tree in the Bible. The olive is a species known for being remarkably fruitful, long-lived and resilient, even in harsh conditions. Later references in the Bible to the olive suggest its link to the promise of life eternal. Olive wood was used to make the cherubim in Solomon's temple. And there we have a direct link to the cherubim who kept the way of the tree of life. In Psalm 58, when comparing men who prefer wickedness over righteousness, David speaks of those who trust in the mercy of God forever and ever, and describes them as being like a green olive tree in the house of God. When writing the kingdom age, Hosea says that Israel's beauty shall be as the olive tree. Our Lord Jesus Christ, immediately prior to his arrest, trial, and crucifixion, went to the Garden of Gethsemane. Gethsemane means press. And there he sought strength from God for the trial ahead, which will restore access to the tree of life. And then you'll recall that Paul likens the extension of the hope of Israel to the Gentiles, to branches of wild olive being grafted into a good olive tree. So the olive tree is a very evocative tree in the Bible and connected with lots of interesting images that can take us to the kingdom age. And anybody who's taken this effort to try to get rid of an olive tree will know how tough and resilient they are. H.B. Tristram makes this observation about olive trees in the Holy Land. To the Oriental, the coolness of the pale blue foliage, its evergreen freshness, spread like a silver sea along the slopes of the hills, speaks of peace and plenty, food and gladness. The trunk too, gnarled and wrinkled, often hollow and scathed, yet yielding abundant crops to the extremest old age, and renewing itself from the inside, suggests the idea of perpetual youth. As we saw in Genesis 3, there was a place of worship established at the east of the Garden of Eden. If that place had survived to Noah's day, it obviously would have been washed away by the flood. Thus, it was that when it was safe for Noah to come and his family to venture forth from the ark, his first recorded act in Genesis 8 verses 20 and 21 is the building of an altar so that offerings could once again be made to God. And in response to that faithful act, God renewed his promise that mercy would be extended to repentant sinners. a hope that was implicit in the promise made regarding Eve's seed, and indeed in the preservation of the way of the tree of life. So Genesis 8, verses 20 and 21, firstly. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And the Lord smelled the sweet savour, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. And then continuing in chapter 9, from verse 12. And God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I will set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be a token of a covenant between me and the earth. And it shall come to pass, when I bring a cloud over the earth, that the bow should be seen in the cloud, and I will remember my covenant which is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the water shall no more become a flood to destroy all flesh. And the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said unto Noah, this is the token of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. So Noah is, as it were, a new beginning after the flood. Adam and Eve had been one beginning, and now we have a new beginning. And a little bit further on in Genesis, in chapter 12, Abraham marks yet another new beginning in God's purpose. It's not surprising, therefore, that in Abraham's life there are parallels with the arrangements in the Garden of Eden. Adam was formed elsewhere and placed in the garden. Abram was formed elsewhere, in Abram's case in Ur, and he was placed in the land of promise, just as Adam had been placed in the Garden of Eden. Although promised possession of the land in perpetuity, Abraham was not given possession during his lifetime. And so we know he underwent a period of probation while God tried him. And in Abram's case, as we know from Romans, his faith was counted unto him for righteousness. To a very remarkable degree, Abram's life is intertwined with Sarah's, as Adam's was with Eve. There are, of course, many married couples in the Bible, but Sarah plays a much more prominent and more integrated role in the life of her husband than that of most wives. And the text reveals some very positive aspects of their relationship, including the fact that she acknowledged the authority of Abraham, as Peter says in 1 Peter 3. Sadly, however, there were also negative aspects in the relationship. In terms of the parallel with the Garden of Eden, the most notable of these is the fact that the text says in Genesis 16 that Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai when she suggested to go in unto my maid Hagar to raise up a seed. The words used in Genesis 16 verse 2 are the same, exactly the same as those used in Genesis 3:17 when God criticised Adam for listening to the words of Eve and taking the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Abram obeyed God's command to leave Haran and travel to the land that God said he would show him, which the record describes in Genesis 12 and verse 5 as Canaan. After initial sojourn in Canaan, Abram and his camp relocated to Egypt before returning to Bethel a second time, as we read earlier tonight in Genesis 13. You may have noticed when we did that reading in Genesis 13 that verse 7 makes the point that the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwelled then in the land. And that's a point that would appear to be rather superfluous, because it was, after all, the land of Canaan, except for the fact that another point is being made, that these races had the potential to be Abram's nemesis, and therefore they are equivalent to the seed of the serpent from the Eden experience. Abram seems to have recognised the parallels between his situation and that of Adam in the Garden of Eden, because trees play a very important part throughout his sojourn in the land. And these trees may be an expression of his yearning for the restoration of access to the tree of life. And I'd just like to read now Genesis 12 verse 6, which I'll read from the Revised Version. some of you may have other modern versions which also reflect this, but if you're reading it from the authorized version, listen carefully to the difference. Genesis 12, verse 6. And Abram passed through the land unto the place of Shechem, unto the oak of Moreh, and the Canaanite was in the land. So he went to the oak of Moreh at Shechem. The Hebrew word rendered plain in the authorized version should indeed be oak, as the revised version and most modern translations have. It's the Hebrew word elon, one of 6 related words which appear to be used somewhat indiscriminately or interchangeably to refer to oaks or similar large, robust trees, such as a terebinth or turpentine tree. 5 of those words are thought to refer specifically to one or more of the acorn-bearing oaks. And some scholars have attempted to align specific Hebrew words to specific oak species, but their conclusions are not consistent, and it seems unlikely then that precision in this respect can be achieved. And in addition, as one of the prominent Israeli botanists has written recently, botanical classification of oaks is very difficult, and few taxonomists agree on how it should be done or which names should be used. It's impossible, therefore, to be definitive as to which species of oak or similar tree is being referred to here. But it is a fact that most of the oak species found in Israel are evergreen oaks, which are sometimes referred to as live oaks. That is, they're not deciduous. We're probably more familiar with what we call the English oak or the pin oak in this country, which are deciduous trees. In fact, most oaks are not deciduous, and certainly most of those in the land of Israel are not. They're evergreen. And being evergreen, they may have suggested to the men of these times a link with the tree of life. Oak trees are renowned for being sturdy, deep-rooted, resilient, and long-lived. When an oak reaches old age and dies from old age, or when it is cut down, it can actually renew itself by sprouting from the stump or roots. And in time, those new roots may develop into a very strong tree. It is recorded that many centuries after all the oak trees in the Bethlehem area had been cut down, people living around Bethlehem would dig up the roots that remained in the ground and use them for fuel. So durable was the timber. The oaks around Bethlehem were all cut down during the Crusades. They were still digging up those roots in the 19th century and burning them for timber. Those facts would, of course, be well known to people who depend on the land for their livelihood, and it may well have evoked in them thoughts of the tree of life, quite separately from the fact that the tree was evergreen. Now, in Genesis 12 and verse 6, there was a tree that could be identified as the oak of Moreh, suggests that it was a large and therefore quite old and perhaps culturally significant tree, significant because of its association with Moreh. Well, what do we know about Moreh? Was Moreh a place or a person? It's impossible to be certain. But as the text says that Abraham was at Shechem, we might presume the name Moreh is more likely to relate to a person rather than Shechem, and perhaps a person associated with Shechem. So, what do we know of the word Moreh? Moreh is a participle of the Hebrew word hora. For those who are not familiar with that term, a participle is a word which has the characteristics of both a verb and an adjective. So it's connected to the Hebrew word hora, which has the idea of giving spiritual direction. It's a word you might relate to what we might know more, might be more familiar with the word Torah, which is a related word, which the Jews use for the books of Moses. The word therefore indicates a teacher or one who gives instruction. Moreh may have been then an individual Canaanite who was recognised as a prophet or a teacher. Alternatively, Moreh may refer to a group or orders of teachers or prophets who acted as priests or oracles at Shechem, perhaps over several generations, and who collectively were known by the name Moreh. So think in terms of, say, something like the school of the prophets. So it could be an individual, could be a class of or order of teachers. Whatever the answer, Abram chose to make his camp at this sacred place. And while there, he was given the second of the promises made to him in verse 7. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land, and there buildeth he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. Did Abram go to Shechem because of the teacher or the teachers who were known to live there? Were they, like Melchizedek, worshippers of the Most High God in the land of Canaan? We cannot be certain, but perhaps they had preserved and were imparting knowledge about the way of the tree of life. Alternatively, and given the passage of time since Noah and the tendency for the truth of the gospel to becoming corrupted over time, there may have been apostate spiritual leaders honoured by the local Canaanites to whom they gave instruction. Now, verse 7 is the first time that Abraham was promised a seed specifically, and the first time that he was promised possession of the land of Canaan. In response, underlining the religious significance of this site, Abram built an altar unto Yahweh, and he was following Adam's example of worshipping an altar associated with a tree. If that were not so, why is the oak mentioned in the text? Because otherwise it serves no purpose. If Moreh was a true worshipper of God, the altar may have been intended to reaffirm that the way of the tree of life, as taught by Moreh, required sacrifice on the part of those who would be reconciled with God. On the other hand, if Moreh was teaching error, construction of an altar immediately adjacent to the oak tree may have been a deliberate statement by Abram that the teaching of Moreh was to be rejected. Abram had just been promised possession of this land, and it would be appropriate that he was keen to make clear to the inhabitants the way of the tree of life. We don't have the time to follow this lead, but it is significant that the oak of Moreh is named in Deuteronomy 11 verse 30 as the site where the Israelites were to gather to recite the law and dedicate themselves to faithful service immediately after the nation had entered the promised land. And Shechem is a very significant place in Bible history. It's very prominent, particularly in Joshua, in ways which evoke Genesis. Shechem was a city of refuge, therefore a sanctuary for those who might otherwise be put to death following accidental manslaughter. Shechem was a Levitical city, reflecting its history as a centre of religious instruction, the way of the tree of life. And in Joshua 24, Shechem is the place to which Joshua summoned Israel to rededicate itself to God's service prior to his death. And we read in that context in Joshua 24 verse 1 that the nation presented themselves before God, just as Adam did before the cherubim, keeping the way of the tree of life. And some 200 years later, in our readings last week in Judges 9, when you come to the time of Abimelech, we would have seen in Judges 9 how the oak tree at Shechem was again associated with events in the history of Israel, no doubt chosen by Abimelech to give his coup attempt some credibility. But as I said, we don't have time to go through those links with Genesis tonight, but it's a fascinating study to look at Shechem and the Lake of Moreh through Israel's history. From Shechem, Abram moved further into the land, encamping at Bethel, as we saw in our reading from Genesis 13, before he travelled even further south in verses 8 and 9 of Genesis 13. In response to a famine, Abram fled to Egypt before returning to the southern regions of Canaan in Genesis 13. When tension arose between the herdsmen of Lot and those of Abram, the two men agreed to separate. And in verse 10, Lot was enticed by the lushness of the lower Jordan Valley. Genesis 13, verse 10. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. Incidentally, that's a different word, plain. That is not the word that's translated elsewhere. It's a Hebrew word, kikar, and means a circle, really. So that is actually a plain. And the Lord lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan. It was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. So the land Lot saw put him in mind of the Garden of Eden. And the Hebrew word gan is used here. It's the same as the word used for the garden in Genesis 2, verse 8. Lot speaks of it as the garden of the Lord. That phrase, such an attractive phrase, surprisingly only occurs in one other place in the Bible, in Isaiah, where the parallelism in Isaiah leads us to conclude that it refers to the Garden of Eden. In Isaiah 51 and verse 3, as you see on the slide, it says, "For the Lord shall comfort Zion, he shall comfort all her waste places, and he will make her wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord." So you see there the parallelism of the wilderness like Eden, and her desert like the garden of the Lord. That Lot made this connection with the Garden of Eden is incidental confirmation that the record of the garden was still very front of mind for later generations of believers, despite the passage of now some 2,000 years since the fall, and that they recognised parallels and made connections with that record. But sadly, you will have noted in verse 10 that territory also reminded Lot of Egypt, from which he recently come. As we know, Lot would find that there was much more of Egypt than there was of the Garden of Eden in the region around Sodom and Gomorrah. Did Lot verbalise the impression made on him that the plain of Jordan resembled the Garden of Eden? Perhaps he did. We can't be sure. But flick back for a moment to Genesis chapter 3. The record of Lot's interaction, the record of Lot's actions in Genesis 13 echoes Eve's fall in the Garden of Egypt. In the garden, we read in Genesis 3 verse 6 about Eve. Genesis 3 and verse 6. "And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat." So Eve saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, and she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat. In doing so, Eve established a path which would be followed by her descendants in generations to come. She saw, she desired, she took. Coming back then to Genesis 13 verses 11, Lot followed this path when seeking to resolve the tension which had arisen between his herdsmen and Abram's. Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld, he saw all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. He desired it before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the Garden of Eden, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose, he took all the plain of Jordan and journeyed east. So Lot moved his encampment to the plain of Jericho, to an area that had become Jericho, being named here, even though he went to live near Sodom, because it's a city that became linked with a curse, as we see in Joshua 6:26. And topographically, Jericho is almost the lowest point in the land. After Lot's departure, Abram remained in the high country above the valley of the lower Jordan, up around Shechem. And while there, and apparently while still somewhere near Bethel and Shechem, the Lord promised Abram and his seed possession of the land forever. Verses 14 and 15. "And the Lord said unto Abram, after that Lot was separated from him, Lift up now thine eyes, and look thou from the place where thou art northward, and southward, and eastward, and westward. All the land which thou seest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed forever." Abraham is invited to look in every direction. Where from? Well, we're not told for certain, but Mount Ebal is just north of Bethel, and Ebal has an elevation of 940 metres above sea level, which means it is 1,198 metres above Lot's plain of Jericho. It is, in fact, the highest point in that part of the land. I think it's likely then that Abram was directed to this pinnacle because from that spot he would have been able to see as far as Dan in the north, Beersheba in the south, to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, and to the Dead Sea and beyond in the east. In short, Abram would have been able to see all the habitable portion of the land of Canaan. Now, we saw already in Genesis 12, verse 7, that this land had been promised to his seed. Now in Genesis 13, Abraham is promised for the first time that both he and his seed will possess the land forever. The Hebrew is ad olam, forever. This is the first time that this term olam has been used in God's dealings with Abram. The word olam is first used in Scripture in Genesis 3, verse 22, in the context of what would happen if Adam were to eat of the tree of life after he had sinned. The prospect of immortality, which Adam had spurned when he listened to Eve, was now being offered implicitly to Abram. So having received that remarkable promise, Abram relocated then to the south, and he pitched his tent at Hebron. Now, Hebron is not the highest peak in that part of the land, but Hebron is the highest settlement in all the land of Canaan. Abram did not just choose a high hill, however, on which to set up his camp. He pitched his tent near a substantial tree. And we'll read Genesis 13, verse 18, and again I'll read it to you from the Revised Version. And Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. The oaks there is the Helon plain again. It's the Hebrew Elon again, which the Authorized Version translates as plain. But is it singular or plural? The Revised Version and many other translations put it in the plural. Most translations, in fact, translate Elon as plural, and they use words like oaks or terebinths. The Jerusalem Bible is an exception in rendering the word in the singular, as is the American scholar Powers Smith, who renders it as terebinth. I think it's likely that there was just one large tree, rather than a grove of large trees. Mamre itself means vigorous or lusty. Now, is this just because I want to think it's one tree? Well, not really. There's historical records that support this. In ancient times, the Jews understood this as a reference to a single tree. Josephus records that Abram dwelt near the oak called Ogyges. The place belongs to Canaan, not far from the city of Hebron. So here, Josephus assigns a specific name to a single oak tree. In another place, he identifies it again as a single tree. A very large turpentine tree, and the report goes that this tree has continued ever since the creation of the world, we read in War of the Jews. Again, Josephus's comment suggests it was regarded as a single significant tree. Such a large tree flourishing in the harsh environment near Hebron would attract attention. Was Abram influenced in his choice of this site by Lot's actions? He had just witnessed his beloved nephew mimic the actions of Eve in the garden. Immediately after Lot's departure, he had been promised the land that would be possessed by him and his seed forever. Now Abram is drawn to a place with a significant tree, probably an evergreen, and Abram may have seen in this a reminder of the tree of life and the need to respect the way of the tree of life. His first recorded act on reaching this site suggests that, because Abram constructed an altar at this site so that he could offer sacrifice to God in the way appointed. Although his large flocks would need to move across a vast area of land, this encampment appears to remain Abram's headquarters for many years. In the next chapter, it's referred to in verse 13, Genesis 14 and verse 13. And there came one that had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew, now he dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and these were confederate with Abram. And we read of this camp again in Genesis 18 and verse 1, by which time his name has been changed to Abraham. And it was here the Lord appeared to him in the form of 3 angels. And the Lord appeared unto him by the oaks of Mamre as he sat at the tent door in the heat of the day. On that occasion, twice we are told in the record that Abraham and the angels communed together under the tree, using the singular, presumably I think meaning the oak of Mamre. as I suggested, we should consider it a single tree rather than a grove. Genesis 18, verse 4, firstly, let a little water, I pray you, be fetched, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. Obviously a very specific tree. And in verse 8, he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree, and they did eat. So there is a specific tree here at this campsite, Hebron, where Abram has based himself. Now, that's all we have time for today. There's a lot more trees in Genesis, which we'll come to in our next class. But I hope that what I have done and started to demonstrate is that there are passages, especially in this case in Genesis, where trees play a prominent part in the record. And the circumstances in which they are mentioned often harken back to the tree of life. And as we noted at the outset, it's a deliberate feature of the inspired word that it employs pictures, word pictures, and motifs that are repeated throughout the text to help us as, well, initially as hearers in the old times and now as readers, to make connections and to apply lessons from the whole counsel of God when considering the import of any passage under discussion. And lots of words in Genesis 13 confirm that such connections were indeed made by God's people in ancient times. And indeed, for us in the next week or so, the next couple of weeks, as we continue our readings in Isaiah, you will note how prominent are the references to the trees in Isaiah. And there are some very lyrical passages coming up in our daily readings in the next couple of weeks, which feature trees in relation to the kingdom age and the time to come. And think about how, as we read those in the next few weeks when they come up in our readings, how they connect up with the promise made in Genesis 3. So that's all we have time for tonight in terms of sacred trees of Genesis. And in our next class next week, we hope to come back to further such incidents in Genesis. And then our final class in a fortnight, you might still be wondering, thinking there's lots of threads hanging down and unconnected. Well, hopefully in our final class, we'll bring that all together and show how it all points forward to Christ, and indeed Christ becomes a fulfillment of these things. So I hope that's been of some interest and has whetted your appetite for where we're heading over the next 2 weeks.